participants are still kind of working their way in here. And I think I'll just kick it off by saying welcome. We're so glad that all of you could join us this evening. It's fun to connect with you, if not in person, at least virtually. We want to start by thanking our wonderful partner in planning this event, the Utah Humanities, and in particular, Willie Palomo, who manages the Utah Book Festival, Utah Humanities Book Festival. And we've partnered with them for years and are always grateful and really look forward to this evening every year. We also want to recognize Summit County's RAP tax for supporting education programs like this one at Swaner. The RAP tax, supports recreation arts and parks, and it's a critical part of our programs here at the EcoCenter. And so with that, I think that I'll introduce Doug Tallamy, who is, of course, our speaker tonight. I have to say that I was lucky enough to hear Doug speak at a Nature Center conference a few years ago. And I found his message to be so inspiring and his data to be really empowering. And after I heard him talk, I thought we have to bring him here to Park City. And so, of course, we had grand plans to have Doug join us here in Park City. But given the conditions this year, that didn't seem like a great idea. So he has been gracious enough to join us virtually today. Doug Tallamy is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he's authored 95 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 40 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. He's also written 2 amazing books, Bringing Nature Home, and then, of course, the one that we'll be focusing on tonight, Nature's Best Hope. Before Doug starts speaking, a few quick logistics. If anybody is having technical difficulties or has questions, you can chat Hunter or me as Doug is speaking, and we can hopefully help you out with those things. And then if you have questions, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat to enter your question, and that'll help us moderate those questions and make sure we've hit all of them at the end. Hunter and I will be moderating those and asking those to Doug. The chat is available for other comments or reactions, but if you have a question that you would like him to respond to, throw it in the Q&A. And I think with that, I will throw it to you, Doug, if you wanna get started.
Can you hear me now? Can anybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good.
You sound great.
We'll start again. All right, we're going to talk about Nature's Best Hope, or what my idea of Nature's Best Hope is. But before we do that, I want to talk about something that happened on the East Coast last fall. It was called an oak mast. And the red oak group, all the oaks got together pretty much over the entire East and decided they would make their acorns at exactly the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so what I did was take one of those acorns and just stare at it. And I didn't have to stare too long before this happened. An insect was chewing its way out of that acorn. And again, didn't take long, maybe 30 minutes. It chewed and it wiggled, and actually it wasn't 30 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. Kind of looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy forced its way through that little hole and then plopped onto the leaf. This is a very dangerous time for this insect because it's delicious. Everything wants to eat it. It's very high in fat, very high in protein. So it's got to get to safety as fast as possible. And what it does is finds a patch of dirt and then starts wiggling. And in about 30 seconds down it goes, where it makes a chamber. It stretches in all different directions, makes a chamber, turns into a pupa, stays there for 2 years, and then comes out as an acorn weevil. This is what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. So females chew a hole down into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in it, and that is how the larva gets down into that acorn. Now you might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the next year? And the answer is that red oak acorns take 18 months to develop. So if they come out the next year, the acorn crop will be much smaller than what they need. Well, that of course leaves a hole in the acorn, a vacuum, a true vacuum, and you know nature abhors a vacuum. Well, there are 3 species of temnothorax ants that specialize on living inside the vacated holes made by acorn weevils. And if they find a hole in a brand new acorn, they get very excited. They want to move their entire colony from their old dilapidated acorn into this new one. So they carry the larvae, they carry their eggs, everybody gets involved. It takes about 30 minutes, but soon they're in there. Then they post a guard at the entrance here to make sure nobody comes in, nobody uninvited guests come in. And they will stay in this acorn for the next 2 years until it falls apart. Well, about this time, my wife says, what is your point? What are you trying to tell us? My point is that that is one of literally millions of specialized interactions that comprise nature. This is another one. There's a very specialized interaction between jays of all different species and oak trees. Oaks, of course, make acorns. Jays are the primary dispersers of those acorns. They will fly about 2 miles from the parent tree and then bury it. And that's how oaks move around the planet as well as they do. You won't have breeding pileated woodpeckers unless you have lots of carpenter ants, because that's what they rear their young on. And you're not going to have lots of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees to make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have this plant, Facilia. That is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. As a matter of fact, out of the 4,000 species of native bees we have, about a third of them are highly specialized. So you guys have lots of sunflowers. There are at least 13 species of native bees where I live that can only reproduce on the pollen of sunflowers. And by the way, I live in Southeast Pennsylvania, in case you didn't know that. So a lot of bee specialization on our native plants. This is the Baltimore checker spot. You won't have that unless you have white turtlehead. Specialized relationships are everywhere. But today, these relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Back in 1908, I think it was, the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. And Teddy heard about this. He was president at the time. He went to the canyon, he looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the creation of the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, of course, that's not an option today. Unfortunately, there's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. So leaving it as it was, again, is no longer an option. And that's because we have logged the country, almost the entire country, repeatedly. We have tilled it, we have drained it, we've grazed it. We've got over 770 million acres of rangeland. And of course, we paved it and otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers, and we've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are now running amok in our natural areas, changing the composition of native plant communities. So in short, we've carved up the natural world into tiny fragments of its former self, each of which is too small and too isolated from each other to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that sustain us. So you might wonder why we've done that. Well, we thought the earth was so big, our nest, it was so big that we couldn't, we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course we were wrong. And that's why we're seeing headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect declines. Followed by this one, North America has lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population gone. UN says up to 1 million species might go extinct just in the next 20 years. And it amazes me, they report this as if it's just another headline. I mean, that's like saying oxygen will disappear in the next 20 years and then not getting excited about it. This is not an option. We cannot lose 1 million species in the next 20 years. It's simply not an option. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that will take small efforts from a lot of people, but they will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return to this headline briefly. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson, the great Harvard entomologist, Now he's 92, I guess. He still writes a book a year, Harvard emeritus. But he told us what it would mean if we lost insects on planet Earth. And way back in 1987, he wrote this book, or this paper, The Little Things That Run the World, talking about the importance of conserving invertebrates, primarily insects. And his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. If they were to disappear, so would most of the flowering plants. And if most of the flowering plants disappeared, that would not only change the physical structure of terrestrial Earth, it would pretty much end energy flow through most terrestrial habitats, which would collapse the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, our mammals, and to a large extent, our freshwater fish as well. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot, as opposed to having the rapid turnover of nutrients by insect decomposers, because the only thing that'd be left would be bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. There is good news here, and that is none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are a product of nature. We are totally dependent on nature. We're totally dependent on what we call ecosystem services, the services that are provided by healthy ecosystems. Let's just mention a few things that plants give us. How about oxygen? Produce oxygen every day. We all need that. They clean our water, slow its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use. Here's an enormously important one right now. They capture carbon, pull it out of the atmosphere where it's, it's doing bad things to our climate. Pull it out of the atmosphere, fix it in their tissues, and then the excess carbon that they pull out of the atmosphere, they pump into the ground. The soil is brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have put into the ground. So the more they pull out of the ground, or out of the atmosphere and put in the ground, the better off we're going to be. Plants also build topsoil, hold it in place. If we didn't have plants on the Earth, it would be one rocky mass because all the topsoil would be in the ocean. They prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, and many other things. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse the seeds of those plants. And again, on and on. So designing landscapes that destroy the production of these ecosystem services is simply not an option today. It never was a good option. But today, with 7.8 or maybe it's 7.9, I don't know, billion people on the planet, we need all the ecosystem services we can get. We can't afford to take out huge portions of the Earth for aesthetical reasons. There were visionaries through the ages who recognized that we humans had a very unhealthy relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent in the early half of the 1900s. He wrote books and he talked, and one of the things he said was, the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there's some indigenous groups have been managed to do that, but by and large, our Western capitalistic extractive culture is terrible at that. We take more than the Earth has to give, and then we move to another place and take it again. And we're at the point now where there's no more places we can go. So Aldo said what we need to do is develop a land ethic. And he wrote about this in Sand County Almanac. He knew we had to use what the Earth offered. We had to farm, we had to get lumber from the Earth and graze and mine and hunt and do all of those things. But we had to learn to do them without destroying local ecosystems. And this is what he called the land ethic in the Sand County Almanac. What has always surprised me is that he didn't write about developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was. First of all, there were far fewer people then, and the pressure on the land from where we lived was far less. But also the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist at the same place at the same time. It was so deeply embedded in Aldo's culture, and it's still embedded in our own, that I don't think he recognized it as an option. Well, what I want to argue today is that living with nature not only is an option, I think it's the only viable option that is left to us. You know, in the past, conservationists worked exclusively where we people weren't. They went to natural places and tried to preserve them. Now we need to do exactly the opposite. We need to save or preserve or restore nature where people are. There are not enough places where we aren't anymore. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Where should we start? Well, we can't ignore private property. And because so much of the US is privately owned, 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned, and somewhere around 75% is privately owned in the entire lower 48. So if we ignored those areas, we would only be doing conservation on a small part of the land, and that is not enough. There are also lots of places that we don't typically think of as options for conservation that we need to start thinking of, like power and pipeline rights of ways. 21 million acres in power and pipeline rights of ways. Railroad rights of ways, 3 million acres. Roadside rights of ways, 17 million acres. We got 4 million miles of paved roads in the US. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Airports, 3 million. You know, the Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are huge areas. Then we have all the places where we live, both in rural areas, our suburban areas, urban centers. That's hundreds of millions of acres. If you add up just those places, and you can think of other places, that's 599 million acres that we could be doing conservation on. How big is that? How big is 599 million acres? Well, it's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, plus Virginia, plus New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, plus California, plus Texas. Add up all those, still less than 599 million acres. So not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We can do it almost anywhere. I use the word conservation, but I'm really talking about restoration. We need to rebuild nature. And I recognize, before you tell me we can't put it back the way it was, probably not exactly the way it was, but we can restore functional relationships in the natural world that support other relationships. In other words, we can reconstruct functional ecosystems that produce those services that we all need. To do that, we can't do it all at once, so we want to start with the animals and the plants that form the basis of the food webs that support other things. In other words, there are some species that contribute a lot more to ecosystems than other species. So we have to start with those building blocks. And again, I'll talk about food webs. Plants, of course, capture the energy from the sun, and they turn it into food, and everything else needs that food. Well, most animals don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants. And that something is typically insects, but it turns out caterpillars are the primary means by which energy is moving from plants to other animals. Caterpillars transfer more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. If we took caterpillars out of the system, most of the energy would remain locked up in the plants themselves, because again, most animals don't eat plants directly. That means we need to have landscapes that include caterpillars. Let's use the Carolina chickadee as an example. It's a typical bird. We'd see at our feeders. They're at my feeder right now. And they're seed eaters all winter long. But when it comes time to reproduce, baby birds typically cannot eat seeds. So they have to switch to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects. That's almost all of them. And it turns out most of those insects are caterpillars. And I've got a little bit of data to support that statement. A recent graduate student, Ashley Kennedy, did a citizen science project where she asked people from all over the country to take pictures of birds while they were foraging during the breeding season. And the idea was to get pictures of them while they were carrying insects back to the nest. And a lot of people got into this. They sent her about 7,000 pictures, and she identified the insects and other arthropods that were in the beaks of those birds. And then she constructed nestling diets. So here's data for 20 common bird families in North America. The green bars are the percentage of the nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So imagine what would happen if we took caterpillars out of the system again. 16 out of 20 of the common bird families would not be able to rear their young. Something special about caterpillars. What is it? Well, there's actually several things special about caterpillars. The first is they're soft. So think of this guy as a sausage. He's like a little sausage with a very thin wrapper, and that thin wrapper is exoskeleton. It's cuticle, which is undigestible. Birds don't want a lot of exoskeleton. And it's wrapped around a lot of good food, a lot of protein, a lot of fat. And because they're soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. They take their beak, it's like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillars, and some caterpillars get huge, but one medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds, particularly during migration, do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They are nutritious, as I said, a lot of protein, a lot of fat, low percentage of chitin compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. So a lot of undigestible material there, and they also have sharp edges so that it's hard to stuff them down the throat of your offspring. And it turns out that birds are the best source of carotenoids, not birds. Caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate. And birds are vertebrates, and vertebrates cannot make their own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids, yet carotenoids are essential components of our diets. So we have to get carotenoids from plants, and that's why my wife Cindy makes sure that I have lots of carrots to get my beta carotene, and lots of tomatoes to get my lycopene, lots of whatever that is to get my lutein. And I'm glad she makes me eat that stuff because it stimulates my immune system. And I can't think of a better time to have a healthy immune system. Carotenoids are also antioxidants. They run around our body, protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality. They improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about primarily male birds. This is a male prothonotary warbler, for example. He had access to lots of luteins. And he took those luteins, made pigments out of them, put them in his feathers. And that's why he's bright yellow. And the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Well, where are the birds getting their carotenoids? From the prey items that they eat. And as you can see, carotenoid levels are not equal across different invertebrate prey items. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of insects. This is third bar is orthopteroids. So things like crickets and grasshoppers and katydids. Here are the adult caterpillars way down here, the moths and the butterflies. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves, and that's where the carotenoids come from. And here's the earthworm way out here. The early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. Does this influence the way birds choose their prey items? Well, Ashley did another study with bluebirds, and what she did was put GoPro cameras on the roofs of bluebird boxes, and those GoPro cameras took a picture once a second. And she had lots of GoPro cameras and lots of bluebird boxes, and she did it for 3 years. So she ended up with over 1 million pictures that she had to go through. And the idea, of course, was to get a picture of the bluebirds as they flew into the house with prey items. And often the bluebirds would land on the roof of the house and pose, and it was great. So she ended up with over 7,600 pictures where she could identify what the prey item was. And it turned out that the ones brought back most frequently, the caterpillars, had the highest level of carotenoids, followed by those orthopteroids, and then everybody else was nestled down here. So it really suggests that birds are one of the criteria, at least, is how many carotenoids does the prey item have. So all of this is to suggest that caterpillars may not be optional parts of bird diets. It's starting to look like they are essential parts of bird diets. So, okay, we know birds need caterpillars. How many do they need? Is 1 or 2 enough? Well, let's ask that question again for chickadees. We have a lot of data for chickadees. The answer is no, 1 or 2 is not enough. They need 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to rear 1 clutch of chickadees, depending on the number of chicks in the nest. And that's just to get them to the point where they leave the nest. Then the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 24 days before those birds are independent. But then they're always flying all around. Nobody can count those. So we're talking about many thousands of caterpillars to make 1 clutch of a bird that weighs 1/3 of an ounce. Where are those caterpillars coming from? Well, if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, they got to come from your yard, because chickadees only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. So when we design landscapes that do not make that many caterpillars, it ends up in local bird decline. And That study, Rosenberg et al. Last year, that said we had lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years, they posted their data, and we could look at which birds were actually declining. And if you separate it into the birds that require insects at one point of their life history versus the birds that do not, so things like the finches and the doves, they can rear their young on milk made from seeds. They actually gained some millions of individuals per species. But the birds that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. So this doesn't prove cause and effect between insect declines and bird declines, but it certainly is suggestive. So I'm concluding we need to landscape for caterpillars. How do we do that? Well, you add caterpillars to landscapes by adding the plants that make them. And that seems easy enough, but there is a catch, and that is most plants don't make many caterpillars. If we look at the number of, if we look at plant genera here, and the number of caterpillar species that each plant genus supports, there are only a few species that support a lot of caterpillar species, and a whole bunch, hundreds of genera that support 1, 2, or even no caterpillars. Now this is data from the Southwest, but you can take data from anywhere, and all these plots look identical. So there's really just a few plants making most of the caterpillars. Why is that? Well, it turns out caterpillars are really fussy about what they eat. Most of them are host plant specialists, like my friend the monarch butterfly here. We all know that you're not going to have monarch butterflies if you only have crepe myrtles or boxwoods or some other thing in your yard. You need milkweeds. That is the only thing they're going to eat. They are host plant specialists. And it turns out 90% of our caterpillars, 90% of the insects that eat plants are highly specialized in what they can eat. And they're specialized because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want them to eat them, so they try to protect their tissue. They load their leaves and other tissues with nasty tasting chemicals. And a lot of times they have physical defenses as well. And it makes those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And if you don't believe me, after this talk, go outside and eat a plant. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. Every single plant out there, unless it's been manipulated by humans, is loaded with these nasty tasting compounds. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there, unless you live in an area where it's so dry you don't have plants. But it's green out there, not because there's no insects that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. Well, we do know that insects eat plants, but how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. Again, 90% of the insects pick 1 or 2 plant lineages that share a common cocktail of chemical defenses. And over evolutionary time, they develop the adaptations that allow them to circumvent those defenses. They develop the enzymes that allow them to detoxify and store and excrete those compounds. They develop the life history adaptations and behavioral adaptations that allow them to avoid or minimize their exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period, again, of exposure, eons and eons and eons, for all those adaptations to fall into place. It does not happen overnight. What I'm trying to tell you is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to rebuild the ecosystem vitality in a particular place, we have to choose the plants that are going to support the animals that support everything else, or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work. And I'm going to start with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. We have 10 acres on an area that used to be a farm. It was split up into 10-acre parcels. It had been farmed for 300 years. We have much longer farmer history here in the east than you have in the west. So the land was exhausted, and before we moved it had been mowed for hay. But when you mow for hay in the east these days, what you're really mowing are rootstocks of all the invasive species from China. And you call that hay. I'm sitting in that window right up there now, and this is what it looked like when we moved in. Not many plants, and where there wasn't construction, this is what it looked like. These are all invasive plants from Asia. Multiflora rose and Oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and privet and calorie pear and ailanthus. And all of these guys are very, very typical invasive plants from Asia in the east. That's my wife, Cindy. She's getting ready to get rid of all this stuff. So you're talking about 10 acres of this stuff. Big job. A lot of people would look and say, it can't be done. Well, it can be done. Cindy did it. What did I do while she was working hard? I told her she was doing a great job, but I also was putting the plants back. Only I put the plants back that I knew would attract particular caterpillars that I thought ought to be at our house, and also the pretty ones that I wanted to take pictures of, like the Canadian owlet. I wanted to take a picture of that beautiful caterpillar. But in order to have Canadian owlets, that's what the adult looks like, by the way, it looks just like leaves, you have to have meadow rue. That is the only plant it will eat, and we didn't have any meadow rue. We had very few plants on our property. There was no meadow rue close by. I still don't know where there are any meadow rue around here. So I got meadow rue seeds from someplace else because it's a plant that ought to be here, planted them. But you know, this was in the early days. I had no idea how long it would take for the Canadian owlet to find its meadow rue. Maybe it would take years. So I planted it, it germinated, but I did not go out and check it. Well, after a month or two, I did go out and check it. It was almost defoliated because the Canadian owlets had found it right away. I had no idea it would be that successful that fast. So now I have a thriving colony of Canadian owlets and meadow rue. So we've increased the number of species on our property by 2 after that little gain. Same thing with the goldenrod stowaway. This is a very pretty yellow moth. Actually, it has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Bidens aristosa, called ditch daisy. I did know where there was some Bidens aristosa in a power line cut about 15 miles away. So I went and collected some seeds, planted them at home. It took that moth a year to find my Bidens aristosa, but now I've got a lot of Bidens aristosa and a lot of goldenrod stowaways. I wanted hackberry emperors because it's a butterfly that ought to be at our house. But of course, hackberry emperors, and that's what the butterfly looks like, requires hackberry. That is their host plant, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I planted hackberries. I planted 7 or 8 hackberries. And another, I mean, it actually took 2 or 3 years for the butterfly to find it, but then it was great. I checked my hackberry, one branch of a hackberry this June as I was walking by. There were 9 hackberry emperor caterpillars on it. So another great success. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, and so did the things that eat goldenrod. There are actually 110 species of caterpillars that eat goldenrod, like the brown-hooded owlet, the Arsidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. Now this is what I'm waiting for. This is the goldenrod flower moth. Still has not made it to our property. So this is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle there. One of these days I'm going to go out and I'm going to find that moth, or I'll find its beautiful larva, and that will be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper for the same reason. I wanted to attract this moth. This is Pandora sphinx. Wanted to take that picture. Wanted to take a picture of its beautiful adult. And while I was waiting for this to come, that took, I don't know, came in the first year, as I recall. But I also got the lettered sphinx. I got the hog sphinx. I got the abbot sphinx. I didn't know these guys were on Virginia creeper, but they are, and so are many other things. Wanted the zebra swallowtail because I think it's our prettiest swallowtail. But it is a specialist on pawpaws. Well, again, we didn't have any pawpaws. Should have, but we didn't. So we planted pawpaws. We had to wait for this one. This required patience because the nearest population of zebra swallowtails was 26 miles away. So while we were waiting, it actually took 9 years for the swallowtail to find our pawpaws, but they have found it. In the meantime, I got the pawpaw sphinx. I didn't know there was a pawpaw sphinx, but there it is. And we got lots of pawpaws. We planted the double tooth, or I wanted the double tooth prominent because it looks like a dinosaur. It's cool. So it's an elm feeder, planted American elm, and they came right away. Wanted the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. So we planted evening primrose, and what they do is hide in those flowers during the day. They're very cute. And we planted lots of oaks. Now this is just, these are examples of what we planted at our house. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. A lot of people think you have to let your oaks mature before they will contribute to your property. This guy, people argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It is a big tree. But you don't have to wait that long. Your oaks will start to contribute to your property almost immediately. And I know that because I started oaks from mostly from acorns. Some of them were small bare root 2-foot plants, But right away, things like the solitary oak leaf miner, the juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar. No, that is the variable oak leaf. This is the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species have come to the oaks we put in our yard. And they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped up first year, and here's a crocus geometer moth standing on the ground eating the leaves of that pin oak. So right away, they start contributing. This is a picture taken from the same perspective I took that first picture, but we put a lot of plants back. Well, we do have lawn, we're very traditional here, but we put plants back. And so many moths, I haven't started to count the butterflies yet, but so many moths have come to our house that I made it a goal to count every species of moth that I encountered. I've been working at it for 4 years, and I'm not done because I keep finding more. And so far, I'm up to 1,012 species of moths, 1,012 species of bird food. Now, we live on 10 acres. That is 37% of all the moths found in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So in 1/240,000th of the area, I've got 37, almost 40% of the species that occur. So this really does work. And because so many species of bird food have come to our property, we've had 55 species of birds breed on our 10 acres. So life is back at our house. I saw this headline last week. The World Wildlife Fund says 2/3 of wildlife had vanished since 1970. Not at our house, not at our house. And as a matter of fact, I'm willing to bet that we have increased the number of species at our house by 2/3. So this is reversible, and that's good news. But I know what you're thinking. What if you don't own 10 acres? Is this going to work? Will it work in a typical suburban yard? Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri, outside of St. Louis. They have 0.6 acres, so less than, just a little bit over half an acre. It's a typical suburban house in a typical suburban neighborhood, surrounded by houses that have very few trees and big lawns. Well, what they did was take out the invasive plant that dominated their yard, which was bush honeysuckle, and they put in other native plants, and they put in a little water feature, and then they sat back and started to count the birds. They're up to 149 bird species that have used their yard, 35 warbler species. That is most of the warblers in the entire country. Just to put this in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. And remember, they have half an acre, we have 10 acres. So yes, it works on smaller properties. Can it work in urban yards? So let's go to Pam Carlson's yard in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. She's got 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And her property is right next to one of the runways of O'Hare Airport, right next to Kennedy Expressway. It is not connected to any natural area at all. She is definitely an island. But on that tiny property, she pulled out her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, a little water feature, and then again sat back and started to count the birds that have come. She's up to 116 bird species that have used her yard, including a woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, you can go to Pam's house in Chicago and enjoy. But what about in an inner city center? 82% of us now live in cities. Are all those people going to be left out? Well, I was looking at this plant. This is Asclepias tuberosa in 2014, and everybody calls it butterfly weed. But that reminds me that we have a terrible marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds, and then wonder why people don't plant them. So we're not going to call this butterfly weed anymore. We're going to call it Monarch's Delight. Well, in 2014, I was staring at Monarch's Delight. The first thing I saw was this bee, a leafcutter bee, a megachilid bee, and it's a species I hadn't seen in years. So I was impressed. I know it's a megachilid bee because it carries its pollen on its tummy, not on its legs. Well, these guys have very specific requirements to make a living. They need pollen, they need nectar, but they also need soft leaves like are found on redbud trees, because they carve out the edge of those leaves, make a little tube, they roll it up, and then they stuff that full of pollen, then stuff that tube into a crack or a crevice. And then they lay their egg on the pollen, and that's how they reproduce. Well, there was redbud right next to monarch's delight. So the megachilid bees, and there was actually another species there, just two species. They had everything they needed. And because there was redbud there were very early blooms, which gave queen bumblebees everything they needed. You know, queens start the colony in the spring. They don't have any workers, so they have to do all the foraging themselves before they make the babies that will become workers. And they need things that bloom very early on so they can forage very efficiently, or it doesn't work. Well, they had milkweed, redbud, so there were bumblebees there. And then I saw a monarch. Now, this is way up on the East Coast in June. Monarchs don't usually get that far north that early. And it was 2014. In 2013, I'd gone the entire year without seeing a single monarch. And that's because 2013 was the low point of the monarch population. Only 3.6% of them left compared to 1976. And I actually saw two monarchs. There was another one over here. Why were they there? Well, they were there because they had monarch's delight. They also had other species of milkweed, so they had nectar, and they had host plants. That's what they need. Do you know where I was? I was on a place called the High Line in the middle of Manhattan, New York. And it's in the middle of Manhattan. It's 30 feet above streets and cement. And this is the amount of nature we're talking about. It's an elevated rail line that had been abandoned for decades. And somebody went up there and looked and saw that a lot of native plants had colonized this space and all on their own in the middle of Manhattan. So they decided, let's actually landscape it, not entirely with natives, but largely with natives, and create a little piece of nature in the middle of Manhattan and see if people like it. Well, people love it. It's a top tourist destination now. Millions of people visit it every year, but that's all. That's what they get. They get a little strip of plants, and there's the monarch's delight. Well, I was impressed. I thought, you know, I knew I'd see pretty plants, but I didn't think anything would be using those plants because Manhattan is not it's not a happy place for nature. But it proved to me that thoughtful native plantings can bring life to the middle of Manhattan, which convinced me we can do this absolutely anywhere. But in order to succeed anywhere, there are four things we need to think about. And the first one, nationwide, is we need to think about shrinking the lawn. Now, I know Utah is not a major contributor to this problem, but in so many other places we do. We have way too much lawn, about 40 million acres of lawn, which is bigger than the area of New England. Look like this. It's a deadscape, particularly the way we manicure it. And I'm not asking people to get rid of their lawn because it's a status symbol. It shows that you are a good citizen and you know how to take care of things and you can follow the rules. And we're not going to stop doing that. But I am asking people to cut the area of lawn they have in half. And if we shrank the lawn by half, we could create a new national park that would be 20 million acres in size. And if we do it at home, we can call it Homegrown National Park. And it would be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, plus Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. And when we bring nature home, when we actually have a park-like setting right where we live, it enables us to develop a personal relationship with the natural world that as adults we may have lost. Maybe we had one as a child, but we've lost it. But as children today, they never had it at all. You know, they've lived in the digital world with no appreciation of nature. As a matter of fact, they're scared of nature. We demonize it all the time. So what they need is the ability to develop a personal relationship with the natural world when they're ready, at their own pace, at their own time. They can do it avoiding crowds. You know, you go to a national park, millions of people there. It's tough to get that experience with nature when you've got so many people around. It's also free and it's never closed. So I don't care how many pandemics come down the road, you can always go out in your yard. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone. This alone part is important. I don't know how you develop that personal relationship with nature if you're crowded with other people. We're worried about kids having nature deficit disorder. That's what Richard Louv tells us to think about. So what do? We put them on a bus. We take them to a natural area, 30 kids in a bus with a teacher. They get out and they walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything. And then they get back in the bus, and that's the end of their natural experience. What they've really experienced is 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have nature outside their front door or their back door, they can do all of that, develop that relationship all by themselves. And my granddaughter has told me you also get to hunt lizards. And this is my granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii. And her patch of nature is about 10 by 10 square feet. It's a tiny little patch with a hedge around it, but there are anole lizards there. So this is how you hunt them. You get on the ground and you crawl very slowly, and you're deadly serious about it. But you have to disguise yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. You can wear your best dress. It's okay. But this is a game that she's created. And you know, this picture is a couple years old. I don't know if she's still hunting lizards, but I guarantee she will remember hunting lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. If you want to do more than hunt lizards at home, get this book, Nature Play at Home by Nancy Stranisti. It gives you lots of fun things that you can do with kids in very small spaces. So we're going to shrink the lawn. The area we're going to take out of lawn has to be replanted, and we want to start with the plants that are going to do the most good. We've discovered a phenomenon that we're calling keystone plants, and that is that there's really just a few native plants. A small percentage of our native plants are making most of the food that drives the food webs, about 75% of our caterpillar food. 5% of our plants make 75% of the caterpillar food. 14% of our plants, our native plants, are making 90% of our caterpillar food, which means there's a whole bunch of native plants not making a lot of caterpillar food. So the question is no longer are natives better than non-natives. On average, they certainly are. But I can build an all-native landscape that supports almost nothing because some plants are just really well protected. So the question really is, do we want ecologically productive plants in our landscapes, or benign plants that aren't doing anything, or even worse, ecologically destructive plants, those ornamentals that escape our plant and become in our yards and become invasive species? I get an email once or twice a year from somebody saying, don't I know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? And that makes them native. You can argue about that, but that makes them native, and therefore the person can plant them and everything will be great. This is not our metric. It's not about where they come from. It's about what they do. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 species of caterpillars. This is what they look like. Nothing is ever eaten out of a ginkgo leaf. So if you want to support the life around you, ginkgos aren't going to do it. Compared to oaks, 557 species of caterpillars in the mid-Atlantic region, over 900 species nationwide. You have hundreds of species supported by the oaks in Utah. So it is the most powerful genus of plants anywhere in the nation, particularly in 84% of the counties of North America. In the driest areas where there aren't any oaks, yes, we're not going to have a lot. But in particularly the mountainous regions of the West, you have a lot of oak species. You actually have a lot more oak species than we have in the East, and they're extremely powerful plants. This is an example of what keystone oaks do in my yard, where I'm counting the moss species. I have 112 moss species so far, not through, and out of that 1,012 species, 888 have known host plants. So there's more than 100 we don't know what they eat. Out of the 888 species, 262 species use oaks. Well, we have 59 genera of native plants, native woody plants on our landscape, only one of which is oaks, the quercus. And we have hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 2% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity, yet they're supporting almost 30% of our moss species. These are the species that are driving the food webs. So imagine what would happen, not just to the diversity of moths in our yard, but the diversity of birds and all the other things that eat those caterpillars if I took oaks out of this landscape. That's the power of a keystone plant. How do you find out what the keystone plants are in your area? You go to Native Plant Finder, the National Wildlife Federation website, and you put in your zip code, and the ranked list of woody plants and herbaceous plants in your county will pop up. Now, I've just listed a few here because I ran out of room, but you get a big long list for the plants that are going to support the most caterpillars, the most wildlife in your county. So notice I say these are the top producers: oaks, native cherries, native willows, native birches, cottonwoods, certainly way up there, native pines. Notice I'm saying native, native, native. You can go to the nursery and buy a Chinese oak. You can buy an English oak. I don't know why you do that. We have about 90 species of oaks in North America. So why would you ever? I don't know. You can get an Asian cherry, certainly those flowering cherries. You can get a weeping willow. You can get a European birch. And as a matter of fact, unless you specify you want natives, that's typically what you end up with. But when you bring in these non-native members of our native genera, you're reducing insect use by 68%. We did that experiment and measured it. So stick with the natives and you'll have a much more productive yard. Your top producing herbaceous plants include the goldenrods, the asters, the sunflowers, the lupines, sagebrush, and of course, many, many others. So people used to say, well, I don't have any idea how to do what you're suggesting because I don't know what the plants are. Now you do know. Now you do know. Just use the Native Plant Finder. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone species, and those keystone plants are going to bring in insects, and then we're going to kill those insects with our night lights. Of course, that's not what we want to do. Light pollution, it turns out, is one of the major drivers of insect declines around the world. How do they, 100 years of studying why moths and other insects fly around lights, we still don't know why they do that, but they do it. And it can kill them in a number of different ways. Exhaustion, they fly around and around and around the light until they just die of exhaustion, or they collide with it, or they get incinerated by it, or they die of dehydration, or the bat comes and picks them off. A lot of night insects that never see day, they don't see bright lights, get blinded by these lights. And then they're stuck there, and if they don't get killed in all these ways, it messes up their daily activities. So again, the research is suggesting that light pollution is a major driver of insect declines. And to me, that is really good news because this is easy to turn around. All you need to do is turn off your lights. I know what you're going to say. Oh, I can't turn off my lights because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your security light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to find out is how often the bad man does not come. But if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb, because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to insects. And yellow LED lights are the least attractive wavelengths. We could save billions of insects overnight if we simply switched out our lights and put in LED lights. And we'd save a whole lot of energy if we did that. So this is easily corrected. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is we need to landscape in a way where the caterpillars we've brought to our yard can complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. They eat the leaves of the oaks, then they spin a cocoon and hang from the branch of the oak, and then they emerge as an adult. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish all the insects did that, but they don't. About 94% of them, 480 species, drop from the oak tree and wiggle their way underground where they form a pupa and spend the winter. Or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under the tree. The problem, of course, is that we don't have any leaf litter under our trees. And we mow our lawns and compact them to the point where they're so hard that no caterpillar can wiggle their way under there. So this becomes an ecological trap. The trees attract the adult moths if they're around. They lay their eggs there, the caterpillars develop, they drop down, and then they die. And the next generation, there are far fewer caterpillars, and pretty soon you don't have any. I believe research is going to show that this is another major driver of insect declines. And of course, the cement landscape is going to be even worse for caterpillar survivorship. I'm not trying to discourage the use of trees in cities. I am trying to discourage the use of cement as the default landscape. That's just laziness. We can certainly do better than that. This is what most people do. They have a big lawn and they put a tree in the middle of it, and nobody's measured what the survivorship of caterpillars are in a situation like that. But I can guarantee it's higher in a situation like this, where you have trees, a layered landscape. This is a native azalea and ferns and ground cover. You could have a dogwood over this. The caterpillars drop down, then it's a safe site. The ground is loose under there. They can get underground. They can pupate. They can spin a cocoon in the leaf litter. They won't get mowed. They won't get trampled. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral garden, very popular out here in the East. And again, it's a safe site for the caterpillars. Or put in your ground covers, your wild ginger or native pachysandra or mayapple or any of the ground covers that you use out west. Safe sites for those caterpillars. There's more good news here, and that is we have found there's room for compromise in our plant choices. And that's, to me, that's really good news. This information is coming from another PhD student that I had recently, Desiree Narango, who worked with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And what she did was compare chickadee population dynamics in typical suburban yards that were dominated by native plants and yards that were dominated by introduced plants, the typical Asian ornamentals that we landscape with so frequently. And the first thing she found is that those landscapes dominated by introduced plants produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So there was 75% less bird food in those landscapes. They also were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So there were nest boxes. She put nest boxes up in each one of those landscapes, and the chickadees would come and they'd look around, but they were smart. They said, there's not enough food here for us to reproduce. We're not even going to try. If they did try, those nests contain 1.5 fewer eggs. They were 29% less likely to survive. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And you might say, well, those aren't huge differences. But if you put all that together in a population growth model, this is what you get. As a function of the percentage of non-native plants in the landscape, percentage of non-native plant biomass, from no non-native plants to 100%. This dotted line is replacement rate. This is the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. If you're reproducing at replacement rate, you're not growing, but you're not shrinking either. It's a sustainable population. If you're reproducing above the replacement rate, then you have a growing population. But if you're making fewer babies than adults that die every year, you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. Right here is where those lines overlap. So what does that mean? It means when you exceed 30% non-native plant biomass in your yard, when you're up in here, you're going to have a declining, unsustainable population. There's simply not enough food to sustain breeding chickadees or other birds in your landscape. But this is good news for two reasons. First of all, this is the first time that this has been measured for any bird anywhere. So if anybody doubts that your plant choices for your yard actually impact other living things besides your plants, look at this study. It should convince you. But this area also is the area of compromise that I'm talking about. You can have your non-native plants as long as they're not invasive and as long as they're less than 30% of the total plant biomass and still have a breeding bird population. Excuse me, I'm choking here. I'm choking because this is such good news. If my message was that you can't have any native, non-native plants at all, very few people would listen to me because we love our beautiful non-native plants. You can have some as long as it doesn't dominate your landscape. Excuse me. Okay, can native plants be used in formal designs? Of course they can. I got this picture. Somebody emailed it to me in the spring. It was a busy day, and I missed the name of the guy who did, and I can't find the email. But what he did was send me this picture. He's the land manager of this very formal garden, and he's secretly sneaking in native plants. This is Joe Pye. Notice I didn't say Joe Pye weed. It's not a weed. And his goal is to replace all of these non-native plants with native plants, just to show you can have a very nice formal garden using native plants. Remember, formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in that design. Our native plants are used in formal gardens in Europe all the time. And I guess it's okay over there because they're non-native plants. Can we get a pollinator garden into this traditional all non-native suburban landscape? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it and all of a sudden it's acceptable. Look at all the species that are in that little area. If everybody did this, we could have much larger and more diverse populations of native bees. How about this? These are Drew Latham designs. This is a bigger area. There's no fence around it, but it's still quite formal. Imagine the life that is here, that is benefiting from these plants compared to the life that is here. Zero, a lot. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can. And there are more and more programs that I'm learning about, and there's probably a bunch out there that I don't know about. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program to encourage homeowners to replace some or all of their lawn with appropriate prairie plants. So they pay you to get rid of some of that yard. Very popular program. There's an island off Florida that is paying its residents to allow burrowing owls to burrow in the front yard. The burrowing owl is a listed species. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on property that you own, we're going to pay you to be a good steward of that species. Everybody would want an endangered species. Missouri had a bounty on Callery pears, a really highly invasive ornamental tree in the east. If you brought in the body of a Callery pear, they would give you a free tree replacement. San Antonio, a public utility, gives people $100 coupons so they can plant plants that help with their water issues. They're trying to get water efficient native species, but that of course helps biodiversity as well. And then you know about the lawn replacement programs that a lot of the states, particularly California and Arizona, have in the West, up to $2 per square foot rebate if you get rid of your lawn and replace it with appropriate xeric plantings. We've made what I consider to be 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. The first is that we've assumed that nature is important, but it's not essential. I mean, you're hearing the reports today about the goals of I don't know, these UN biodiversity initiatives. They're supposed to save so much biodiversity by 2020. They had like 10 goals. They didn't meet any of them because we don't think nature is essential. We like it, but if this push comes to shove, it always gets a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and this was a wall-sized poster that sums up what I think our entire culture feels about nature. I hear top conservationists say this: we want to save wildlife for future generations, implying that we want our kids to enjoy the wildlife that's here, but that implies nature's there just for entertainment, and if it disappears, they won't get to enjoy it, but who cares? We need to save nature so that we have future generations. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about keeping the planet habitable. Second misstep is that we've assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, I talked about this. If we restrict conservation efforts only to the untouched areas of the planet, it's going to fail because those areas, there's not enough of them. They're too small. They're too isolated from each other. David Quammen has this excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. This is not 71 Persian rugs. It's 71 rug fragments, none of which act as a Persian rug. And this is what we've done to our ecosystems and put no man's land in between each one of those fragments. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance, but that to me suggests there are places on planet Earth that have no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the Earth has ecological significance. And what we need to do is improve the ecological significance of so much of the Earth that we have destroyed it on. And that includes our yards. What we need to do is put the plants back in between our rug fragments here. We got to glue our ecosystems back together again, starting with those keystone plants, then adding diversity later on. We're not just building biological corridors so that plants and animals can move back and forth. We are building areas in this no man's land that are so rich with good plant life that the animals can actually live there. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet. And I don't know why, because every human being on the planet entirely depends on the quality of Earth's ecosystem. Even if you hate nature, you absolutely need it. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of good Earth stewardship? I have no idea. Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with these mindsets, you're taught them. We need to change our culture so that we teach this I have obligations part because we do. We do. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And I like this approach because it empowers each one of us. You know, right now, so many of us feel powerless. What can one person do? The Earth's problems are so huge. And it's true, they are huge. But this is something where one person can make a difference. Go out and plant that keystone plant. Plant the most powerful plant you can find on Native Plant Finder in your yard, or if you don't own a yard, in your local park or preserve. You know, you can volunteer in park or preserve. They're all short of labor. They're all short of funds, and you can make a difference there. And that empowers you. It makes you as an individual, the next day you can measure what is actually using that. It does make a difference. It also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't worry about the entire planet's problems. That is too overwhelming. Just worry about your little piece of planet Earth. Shrink the lawn, put in a pollinator garden, use keystone species, and get rid of your invasive plants. If everybody did that on all the area in the country, we'd be 75% done. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we choose to do so is going to determine nature's fate, and that will ultimately determine our own fate. Now, I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much. I'm done.
Thank you, Doug.
You're welcome.
That was wonderful. Awesome. So we can hop on to some questions.
Okay.
Nell, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
I can start here. I unmuted, yes. So one of the first questions that came in tonight was this from Ernest Oriente. Al Gore speaks about how many years we have before we cross the tipping point of global warming. What's your take on this? How many years do we have left? And he put this in as you were talking about species. So I think that Ernest means kind of in relation to species loss.
Mm-hmm. You know, there's not a single year where everything's going to collapse, but there's a lot of research that shows the number of species in an ecosystem creates its productivity and its stability. So if you have a lot of species, the ecosystem's really productive, grinding out those ecosystem services, and it's really stable, so that if we perturb it, it goes back to its original state much faster. But as you start taking species away, that happens slower and slower, and pretty soon you get ecosystem collapse. So every time we lose a species, and it's not just global extinction, it's local extinction that counts, because that's where ecosystems function. Look at the number of species that are in your yard and figure out how many species were there before it was your yard. If it's fewer, you can start to rebuild that number. And I guarantee if it's fewer, that local ecosystem is producing fewer ecosystem services. So, you know, it's a continuous slide in the wrong direction. But what I hope I've convinced you of tonight is that, you know, by putting the right plants in your yard, you can turn it around. You can rebuild that. I guarantee that my little piece of the earth right here is much more productive and much more stable than it was when we moved in. You know, if he's wondering whether we can lose 1 million species, no, that is definitely in the danger land. So we need to, people say we've got to stop the decline of populations, or we have to slow the decline. No, we've got to stop it. We got to reverse it. We can't, you know, having things declining at any rate is not acceptable.
Well, judging by the chat here, it looks like you have inspired and convinced the audience today, that's for sure. The most recent question that came in, I want to ask, it is from Lena, who is age 6, and she would like to know what your favorite caterpillar is.
Okay, it's the spun glass caterpillar. She can look it up on the web, put in spun glass moth, and the caterpillar will come up. It looks like spun glass. It's light blue. It has little globlets all over with little fringes. If a glass blower could actually create the spun glass caterpillar, they'd be really, really good. It's absolutely stunning. It eats oaks, by the way.
Perfect. We'll work on the oaks.
I'm putting a comment. Nell, if you want to ask the next question, I found some pictures of a spun glass caterpillar.
Okay, good.
Perfect. So this question was voted to the top of the question list, which was, do you have any specific plant recommendations for this area, the high desert, 7,000 feet? I know you provided us with a link, and Hunter included that in the chat as well. Along those lines, somebody was asking, like, do scrub oaks count as a keystone plant?
Yes. No, that's a good point. Our recommendations are at the genus level.
Okay.
And the first thing people say, well, which oak is best? And the answer is, we don't know. I mean, nobody's done that research yet. I actually have a student looking at that for the East Coast here, but of course he's not looking at any of your Western oaks, and that's where most of them are. You've got a lot of oaks. But oaks protect themselves with tannins and very tough leaves. So if a caterpillar is adapted to eating tannins and tough leaves in one oak, it almost certainly is adapted to eating tannins and tough leaves in lots of species of oaks. There are 3 groups of oaks. There's the red oak group, the white oak group, and you have the canyon oak group as well. And I'm sure there are differences between those different groups, but for right now, we know that oaks are the best. And which oak is a little bit better than others, we don't know, but don't worry about that. Just plant any oak you can get, any native oak, and you will be doing well. But don't forget your native willows too. Now that needs to be along a riparian situation, but whenever you've got water, willows are really important plants as well. They also bloom very early in the season, so they're essential for early season bees. So they're ranked really highly as well.
That's great.
Cottonwoods way up there too. Don't forget your cottonwoods. They're keystone species all over the West.
Perfect. Well, some of those that are on the attendee list I know have volunteered with us, and we have planted thousands and thousands of willows in riparian areas. So some
Excellent.
of these folks are very familiar with willows, and others can come learn. Along the lines of the last question, is there a way to find out which caterpillars eat which native plants? Like, is there a database?
Yes, that's also on Native Plant Finder. So you can go either way. You can put in your favorite caterpillar and it will take you to what it's eating. And that will work. But David Wagner is, he's Mr. Caterpillar. He's written books for the East, the caterpillars of Eastern North America, and the owlets. And he's for, I don't know, at least the last 10 years has been working on caterpillars of Western United States. And every time I see him, I tell him, finish that up, because a lot of people want to know what this is. And he will soon, but that's going to be just a marvelous resource. You will be able to find all the caterpillars, and we've got 14,000 species of caterpillars, but a lot of them. And he will tell you everything he knows about them, what they eat, where to find them. So I'll tell him that you're asking. Get him going again.
Okay, I think, we have what, I don't know, 74 people or something that are going to be keeping an eye out for David Wagner's publication.
That's right.
So we have a question here from Sally Rinder Connect. Can you tell us something about the use of pesticides in the destruction of ecosystems? It's a big question.
There are, remember the slide, insects are the little things that run the world. Pesticides are the things that kill insects. We have this idea that all insects are bad. We used to have National Insect Killing Week that was designed to promote the use of all forms of pesticides to rid the community of insects. Now this was several years ago, and we've gotten smart enough. But that's still part of our culture. If people see an insect, they grab the can of Raid or they hire the exterminator, not realizing that almost all of them are beneficial. Yes, we're not going to tolerate termites that eat our house, but almost everything else people want to kill just for entomophobia. We're scared of them or we're afraid of them, but there's really no good reason. So yes, pesticides kill them all. And that includes mosquito fogging. I don't know if you do a lot of mosquito fogging in Utah, but it's a major problem around the country, and it's surrounded by misinformation. Mosquito Joe comes and he fogs your neighborhood or he fogs your neighbor's house, and he says, well, this is a natural product, and therefore it's okay. It is a natural product. It's pyrethroids that come from plants, but so does cyanide come from plants. So natural doesn't mean it's safe. He'll also say it only kills mosquitoes. Not so. It kills every insect that it comes in contact with. And it also doesn't work. You kill mosquitoes in the larval stage, not at the adult stage. When Mosquito Joe comes through, he kills about 10% of the mosquitoes. To get control, you need to kill 90% of them. So programs that target larval mosquitoes are the ones that actually work. And you can do this at home with a product called Mosquito Dunks. Get a bucket of water. And this works really well in your dry areas because you don't have a lot of water. Bucket of water, put straw or hay in there and let it ferment for a couple of days. And that becomes an irresistible oviposition site. That's where the female's going to lay her eggs. So she lays her eggs. When the eggs hatch, you go to the hardware store and buy, it's called Bacillus thuringiensis. It's just mosquito dunk. And you put one of those discs in your bucket and the larvae come and chew on it. And it's a disease and it kills aquatic diptera. And only aquatic diptera. So it's not going to kill any dragonfly, not going to kill any non-targets in your bucket. There is one potential warning. I see the picture behind you there is a nice pond system. Don't put your mosquito dunks in there because then it will kill the other aquatic diptera, things like chironomids, the midges, that are really important to that ecosystem. Remember, mosquitoes do not come from permanent bodies of water. They come from temporary bodies of water. They come from the ruts in the road that when you have a thunderstorm, they fill up and right away mosquitoes hatch and then they're gone because they're not there long enough for the predators to find them and control them. But in a permanent body of water, particularly one that has fish, everything eats mosquitoes. So they're the basis of the food web there and everything depends on them. You don't want to wipe that out. But in your little bucket there, that's controlled. If everybody did that, you'd have far fewer adult mosquitoes. And it's cheap and you're not hitting non-targets. So.
Here,
by the way, homeowners use more pesticide than agriculture does.
For the local folks here, I know that our mosquito abatement does try to hit them in the larval stage, but they do also employ fogging and do that in the neighborhoods, particularly if they get a complaint. Another question here relates to the climate crisis. You didn't talk a lot about that and how it's associated with these insects. Do you think that that's, how do you think that plays in with all the rest of this?
The virus are you talking about?
The climate crisis.
Oh, the climate crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah. Climate change is one of the drivers of insect declines. And it's not what you think. It's not the gradual warming that's the problem. It's the erratic weather that's the problem. It's the serious droughts that are very hard on insects, very hard on the plants that the insects depend on. Certainly fire, you get to the point where you burn up everything, that kills everything. Where I live, we're having too much rain at the wrong times. And by too much, I mean a couple summers ago, we had a thunderstorm that gave us 7 inches of rain and 3 inches in 20 minutes. It was like a fire hose, and it just scoured the plants. And I look at caterpillars all the time in my yard. They still haven't recovered. We're in the 3rd year after that. I mean, they're there, but the numbers are way down because we keep getting all of these things. Look at the Gulf states with hurricane after hurricane after tropical storm and 20, 30 inches of rain. That kills insects. So it's that variability and extremes that is very hard on insects. So climate change is taking its toll. There's no doubt.
Thanks for including that clarification. There's a question here from our wonderful co-host, Willie Palomo. He asked, are there any tips you'd have specifically for low-income communities, maybe low-income families seeking to plant more native plants? Where can we find low cost or grants for these kinds of things?
Right. Well, you know, this is a tip for low income, but for anybody really. We have this idea, we want instant gratification. So people always want to plant big plants. If they're planting a tree, they want to plant a 15-foot tree so that it's there right away. That is always a mistake. First of all, it's very expensive, has a 50% chance of dying. And even plants that we consider to be slow growers, like those oaks, plant it as an acorn. It's free. Now you may have to, I don't know what your deer issue is there, but we've got way too many deer and you have to protect those little plants until it gets past deer browse. But you can plant plants that cost nothing, or you can get those little bare root whips, $2 a whip, and start your plants. They grow. That's the wonderful thing about plants. They all grow. And right now, my biggest challenge at home is not putting in plants. It's actually editing. I put in too many. I'm losing my son, and they're crowding each other. So because you just can't picture how they're going to grow so much, but they really do grow. So the cost of the plant doesn't have to be an issue. Get tiny plants. And give up that instant gratification, but then appreciate the process. Watch your little guy grow, and you get very attached to it. So that would be one way to help.
I love that. We have a comment here from Dee Downing, who owns a landscaping company here in Summit County. She says, I'm struggling between creating a fire defense and creating habitat. Building soil, i.e. organic matter left on the soil, and creating habitat is in conflict with the defensible space that's really being emphasized here. Organic matter left on soil is tinder for firebrands flying far ahead of a wildfire. And that's more of a comment, but I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah, there's no doubt you have that fire challenge that we don't face in the East. I've been on some programs in California in particular. And I remember one comment, the Paradise Fire and many of these fires, most of the fuel is coming from the houses themselves. They are not building to code. The codes have, if you build your house today, you have to do this for fire protection. But if you built it yesterday, you don't have to do it. So what is fueling these fires, and you see all these pictures of the house totally gone with trees standing right next to it. It wasn't the trees that did it. It was the man-made structures that provide so much fuel in these fire climax communities. Our big problem, of course, is we are moving into areas that traditionally burn. And then we suppress the fire when the fuel builds up, and then of course you have these mega fires. But I understand the problem. You want to have plants that are going to support the wildlife. I don't have a great answer to that, other than in a typical fire climax community, you have lots of small fires, lots of ground fires that don't reach the ground, and you don't have these mega fires that send embers 2 miles ahead. So that's the situation we've gotten ourselves into, and that's what then the roof catches on fire and everything else. So proper management will reduce the fire risk over the years, but we haven't done that for 100 years, so we're in trouble in a lot of places.
Thank you. So a question that I was just looking at here, I think it must have gotten voted up the list here. Um, okay, so here we go. Besides beauty, is there scientific argument for variety in caterpillars for bird diet?
Hmm. Um, Good question. I have never gotten that question before.
Oh, all right.
Birds, birds are caterpillar predators, and they need caterpillars. And there are lots of types of caterpillars they don't like. So, for example, they don't like hairy caterpillars unless they're cuckoos. Yellow-billed and black-billed cuckoos specialize on hairy caterpillars, but most birds can't deal with the hair in their esophagus and their stomach. And they don't like caterpillars that are chemically protected, that are aposematic. They advertise their bad taste by being brightly colored. The monarch is one of those, so birds avoid those. But the others, they're not that fussy of. They really like caterpillars in the family Geometridae, the inchworms, because they're plentiful, they're green, they don't have any spines or hairs, and so they can eat them with very little cost. So, but whether you have lots of species of geometrids, to the bird probably doesn't matter at all. What matters, though, is having good populations of those caterpillars every year. So, for example, if I had 1 or 2 species of caterpillars in my yard, and it happened to be a bad year for those species, because caterpillar populations go up and down, they're not steady all the time. Well, then there wouldn't be nearly enough caterpillars for the birds to reproduce. But if I have 1,012 species of caterpillars in my yard, even if many species are down, some species will be up. And that will provide the stability in the ecosystem that will allow birds to reproduce every year. And if you're a chickadee or anything else, you want to do that because these birds don't live very long. You don't want to skip a year. So that's the best argument for diversity in your caterpillar community, is that it provides the stability so that the caterpillar users will be able to thrive every single year.
Along those lines, related to kind of the ecosystem, we got the question, can the voracious eating of, plants by caterpillars harm the native plants? Can there be?
Yeah. I'm surprised I haven't gotten that earlier because, we've been taught that if anything eats your plant, you got to kill it right away or the plant's going to die.
Sure.
That's simply not true. Plants have always been eaten. I mean, picture a Brontosaurus eating a plant. They eat a lot of plants, and plants are really good at rebounding from insect herbivory. It's true in some of our stressed environments, when we put plants in the wrong place, they're water stressed, they're dying anyway, and then they get defoliated by an insect, that can kill them. But first of all, defoliation by native insects is rare. Most of the defoliators are introduced insects, particularly in the East. The gypsy moth and Japanese beetle goes crazy, and hemlock woolly delegate, all these introduced pests. When I say we want insects, I am not talking about non-native insects. They come without their natural enemies and they're way out of whack, and that's not what we're talking about. What was the question?
Can the native plants be harmed by voracious appetites?
And the other thing is that many, in the spring, the birds are eating all those caterpillars, and then after the birds reproduce, they don't eat as many, and that's when you tend to get insects building up. So they start to eat the plants later on in the year, after most of the photosynthesis has occurred. So if I went out right now, all of my oak trees still have their leaves. If I picked off every single leaf, it wouldn't hurt them at all. They've already done their growing for the year. They've stored most of their food. So herbivory later in the year is not a big deal. Plants are just much more resilient than we give them credit for. Usually we are upset because it mars their appearance. If we thought plants were there for decorations, we want them to be perfect decorations. But I met a woman in New Orleans, Tammany Baumgarten, who said we should all practice the 10-step program. You take 10 steps back from your trees and all your insect problems disappear, because you can't see those little damages anymore. That's good advice.
Okay, so one thing we haven't really touched on in our questions yet is the light piece of this, the light pollution piece. And we have a couple questions about that. So I'm going to switch gears. Somebody asked, they're wondering about the color spectrum, Kelvin or heat generated minimal. And then somebody said, is there a certain quality of LEDs that makes them better, better options?
Yeah, I don't know what the physics of LEDs is or why it's less attractive. I do know that mercury vapor lamps, which they're typically used for those great big security lights on poles, those are the worst. They're the most attractive. It's a mixture of white and blue wavelengths that are really attractive to insects. So the more you move it to the warmer wavelengths, the yellows, the less attractive it is. And that's as far as my physics allows me to go. But
Yeah. We'll have to do a talk with the dark skies folks to talk more in depth.
Yeah, it fits right in with them. Exactly.
That's right. We'll do that next. So one person says, I'm all for this idea of, planting the native plants and removing some grass. Unfortunately, some other inhabitants of my household are not. Are there any other points to help convince them to get rid of some of the lawn? Also, are there other plants that support different species like moose?
Different species like what?
Like moose, which is a fairly common visitor around here.
Oh, wow. Moose eat a lot. They love those willows and
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have a lot of moose problems in southern Pennsylvania, but I can appreciate that a little bit because certainly my wife Cindy is extremely supportive of all this, but she does like neatness and the idea that a native landscape has to be sloppy, which is not true, but still she always wants me to neaten up. So I try to use hooks. I don't talk about caterpillars, I talk about bird food. So a lot of people that hate insects like birds, and they don't, if I said, look, if you plant this plant, it's feeding your birds. It's feeding your birds at a time when bird feeders are not, because they can't eat seeds. That sometimes works in convincing somebody. But, this is our only planet, and killing everything on it because we don't like the other life forms is not a viable option. So maybe we just go back in your childhood and figure out what it was that made you hate life. I don't know.
I like the hooks. I like that you talked about that. Like in your conversation with the Endangered Species Act, like we should be incentivizing instead of penalizing,
Yeah, well, that is a good point. Money is a great hook. And if we change the tax structure, even people that didn't like, life would tolerate it. Oh, I get a tax benefit for having less lawn. I'll go for it, so.
Yeah. So you mentioned bird feeders, and we did have a question about that. Do bird feeders kind of interrupt this natural cycle?
No, if properly deployed. So bird feeders are wonderful supplements for birds, particularly in human-dominated landscapes in the wintertime when we don't have a lot of insects. We're in the deciduous temperate, no, we're in the temperate zone, and insect production during the winter certainly goes way down. If you're up in the mountains, it certainly is way down. So that's the time to supplement your birds. Many birds are, most of the birds that stick around in the wintertime rely primarily on seeds, but and there are ornithologists that say, well, you don't have to feed the birds; they can find the food on their own. But that is certainly not true where I live, where there's just way too many houses, and the fields that used to be there to make these seeds, they're gone. So there are many birds. A lot of studies have shown that when there's feeders out, birds enter the breeding season heavier and in healthier shape, and they can lay more eggs. So there's no doubt that bird feeders properly deployed, where they're not putting out rancid seeds or they're not too close together to encourage disease transmission, do help the birds. I don't do it during the summertime because it's too warm. It's tough to keep the seeds from going rancid really quickly in the warm weather. And there is a lot of life out there during the summer where they can feed themselves. It's the winter that I feed them.
Okay, I love that. It's nice to know what we can do in the winter when we're not planting our new native
That's right.
gardens.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, I'll ask just one more question as we start to wrap up here. And this was a comment that is about agriculture. So they say, I love the movie Biggest Little Farm. And I don't know if you've seen that, Doug, but you know, about sustainable ag.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And is that sustainable, and is that something that could help in this scenario?
Well, that's sustainable. Is it enough to feed 7.8 billion people? That's the real question. And the answer is probably no. You know, what's not sustainable is the number of people we have on the planet. It's over the carrying capacity. And nobody wants to talk about that. And we pretend that, you know, doing little things that work locally is gonna work on a planet-wide system. And I don't, you know, we can improve the ability, we can raise the Earth's carrying capacity by putting the plants back, but we cannot keep growing forever as a human population because the planet is not growing. We're not getting more resources to compensate for that. And the more resources we take for ourselves, the fewer are around for other organisms. So that said, there's plenty of things we can do to agriculture to make it more sustainable. The mega farms that got rid of all of the hedgerows got rid of an awful lot of life when they did that. You know, we have a problem in the East being a big place, with Roundup Ready corn and soybeans, where now you can spray Roundup and kill all the weeds, not just in your field, but growers are doing it right up to the road. Now, the edge of the fields used to be all mostly native plants. That's where the milkweed was, and the asters, and all the blooming plants that supported the migrating monarchs. Now it's grass. They got rid of all of those, quote, weeds and put in lawn, and it's a total deadscape. It doesn't have to be that way. Now, we could subsidize agriculture. We could subsidize growers. If you're going to give us part of your acreage and reduce your income because of that, we should be paying you to do that. Because you're using your land to produce ecosystem services that we all use. So everybody who lives in a city, we ought to have a pay-per-use fee, not a tax, a fee. We have no trouble paying to watch a movie on Netflix because, you know, we're getting a service. We're going to pay, we're going to watch the movie. Well, every time we use the earth, we're getting a service and nobody wants to pay for it. You expect to get it for free. Everybody who lives in a city requires a lot of ecosystem services. And if it's coming from the areas that are now in agriculture, we have to subsidize them. So $10 a year, that's the cost of one trip to Starbucks. Nobody would even notice it. That would produce, you know, what, $3 billion a year in the US that we could put to conservation. And a lot of that could go towards making our agricultural areas more biodiverse.
Well, thank you for those words. I'll share one final comment. Somebody who's attending tonight from Jupiter, Florida says, your photos are stunning and engaging. While the big Keystone species get most of the attention and funding, it's the little quiet things that often keep an ecosystem vibrant. Viva caterpillars! Thank you. So there are lots of thanks in our chat as well. And we want to thank you for taking the time tonight and sharing all of this with us and sharing your research, which I think is super inspiring.
Well, thanks for hosting me.
Thank you so much, Doug.
Anytime. And when we can have you in person, we're going to do that too.
Yes.
Yeah, you know, I've never given a talk in Utah.
Oh.
One of the few states I have not talked in, so.
I'd like to follow up really quickly just with everyone watching as well. Thank you for joining us. I will send the recording of this video to you later in the week. I will also send a survey to you, so if you could take the time, the couple of minutes to fill it out, it's super helpful to us in figuring out what other presenters to bring in and in getting funding for these kind of programs. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much, Doug.
All right, take care.
Have a nice evening, everyone.
Have a great night.
Thanks.